You're all set.
Ready up?
Yep.
All right, good afternoon. On behalf, and yes, I did get a haircut for those of you thinking to yourselves, yeah, I see the reaction. Of course, my name is Aman Sharma, and on behalf of the Federalist Society here at Moritz, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on affirmative action in public education. We're very pleased to have Roger Clegg speaking with us today. We'll have commentary by Professor Richie Batra afterwards. The format for today, as usual, will be a 35-minute speech, 35 to 45 minutes by our guest speaker, followed by a 10 to 15-minute commentary by our resident OSU faculty member. I'll do the introduction and we'll get going. Roger Clegg is the President and General Counsel for the Center of Equal Opportunity, where he focuses on legal issues arising from civil rights laws, including the regulatory impact on business and the problems in higher education created by affirmative action. He's a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Reagan and Bush administrations. Mr. Clegg has also held the second highest positions in both the Civil Rights Division and in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division. He's also held several other positions in the U.S. Justice Department, including Assistant to the Solicitor General, Associate Deputy Attorney General, and Acting Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy. With that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Roger Clegg.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction and for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I most appreciate Dr. agreeing to comment. We were saying beforehand that we'd like this to be more of a conversation, rather than a knockdown, drag-out debate, and I think that's fine. I actually think this topic lends itself to that pretty well. Let me mention, first of all, so that I can clear some of the stuff out that's in front of me, that one reason I came to campus today was to release a study that my organization did on racial and ethnic preferences in undergraduate admissions at two Ohio public universities. And the two Ohio public universities are Ohio State and Miami University. And my organization does this kind of thing. Is it a problem if I'm moving around?
I can
sort of.
Yeah.
I'll try to remain immobile then.
Thanks.
One of the things that my organization does is get admissions data from universities, and then we do a regression analysis to show how heavily race and ethnicity is being used in admissions. Frequently, one of the arguments made by the proponents of affirmative action in higher education is that, well, race is just being used as a tiebreaker, it's really not being weighed that heavily, it's just one factor and so forth. And of course it turns out that's not true, that frequently it's the case that race and ethnicity are a huge factor in whether you get in or not, and that's what we found at Ohio State and Miami University in its undergraduate admissions. So anyway, that was the study that we released today, and hope you enjoy reading it. It's on our website as well. Well, let me begin this conversation by sort of defining what we're, I think, talking about when we talk about affirmative action in college admissions. By the way, we can talk about K through 12 issues also, but as Professor Batra and I were discussing, the issues at K through 12 are a little bit different, and the law is a little bit different. So, my presentation anyway, I'm going to talk about higher education mostly. Some of the points I make would apply to K through 12 education as well, but anyway, that's going to be my focus. Well, should we have affirmative action in university admissions or not? Well, the first thing we have to do is define affirmative action, because it's an ambiguous term, and its meaning has changed over time, and it means different things to different people. The term was first used in the civil rights context in an executive order that President Kennedy signed in March 1961. So we're actually coming up on the 50-year anniversary of it. And what it meant in that executive order was taking positive steps, proactive measures, just what it sounds like, affirmative action to make sure that you weren't discriminating on the basis of race or ethnicity. Well, that's no longer controversial. I don't have any objection to that. I don't think anybody has any objection to that. It doesn't raise any legal issues. But it was still necessary in 1961 because this was pre-Civil Rights Act. There were a lot of companies out there that the federal government was doing business with that refused to hire African Americans in particular. So the idea was that the federal government, when it entered into contracts with companies, wanted to make sure that they weren't discriminating, and that would require some affirmative action on the part of companies that had, up until then, a pronounced policy of racial discrimination. It wasn't enough just for the executive of the company to say, "Oh yeah, we don't do that," and sign a piece of paper. You would have to communicate this new policy to everybody in the organization. You would have to enforce it. You would have to make sure that this kind of discrimination was no longer allowed. And so it made sense. But as I say, it's a policy that really is not controversial anymore, and I certainly don't have any problem with it. Another early meaning of the term affirmative action was, casting a wide net. Again, if you had a company that for years was not interested in hiring African Americans, that would affect how they did their recruitment, right? I mean, you wouldn't bother to send your recruiters to historically black colleges, for instance. Or if you weren't interested in hiring Latinos, you wouldn't advertise on Spanish language radio stations. Or, if you weren't interested in hiring women, you wouldn't send your recruiters to historically female colleges and so forth. And the idea was that if you're really serious about wanting to hire the best qualified individuals, regardless of race or ethnicity or sex, you would change your recruitment policies to cast a wider net, to let everybody know that they were welcome to apply. Well, again, that kind of affirmative action is not problematic either. It's not problematic legally, and it's not problematic, as a policy matter, at least to me. The only kind of affirmative action that I object to is what Nathan Glazer called affirmative discrimination. That is, you are considering race and ethnicity or sex in your policies, and it makes a difference in some instances whether somebody gets into your college or not. If you're considering race or ethnicity, then it must mean that in some instances it is going to make the difference on whether you get in or not, right? Because if it never makes a difference, then you don't need to consider it. So if you are considering it, it must be because it's going to make a difference sometimes, and when it does make a difference, then racial discrimination has happened. Okay? So we're talking about racial discrimination. Now, that doesn't mean that the issue is decided, because it might be that the reasons, the benefits of taking race into account, of engaging in this kind of racial discrimination, outweigh the costs. But we have to, I think, acknowledge that we are treating people differently because of race or ethnicity. All right. Well, this is a very emotional subject, and people have strong feelings, and it's, I think, unrealistic for me to think that I'm going to make many conversions, right on the spot, in talking about this. But what I do hope to do today is to suggest a framework, very simple framework, for thinking about this issue. And as I say, the issue is very, straightforward. And I've already alluded to it. We want to consider the possible benefits of this kind of discrimination, but then we also have to consider the costs. And I'm going to list what the purported benefits are and then demolish them. But again, I'm realistic, and no doubt some of you will say, well, you know, that Mr. Clegg, he's a very facile, glib-sounding guy. He makes some very clever arguments, but I don't buy it. I think there actually are some benefits to racial and ethnic discrimination in university admissions. Okay, fine. You know, maybe I won't be able to convince you of that, but you know that there aren't any benefits at all. But what I do hope to leave you with is that you can't end your analysis there. You then have to say, all right, maybe there are these benefits. You know, maybe it's something greater than zero, but I have to consider the costs too. You can't just consider, and I think too often the debate just focuses on what the, you know, whether there are any benefits or not, and then that's the end of it. And people don't go on to the next step, which is to consider what the possible costs are. And you know, my thesis is that the benefits, not only am I going to demolish them, but even if you think that I haven't completely demolished them, that there is a stone or two left of them, that the costs of this discrimination are huge and undeniable, and outweigh, you know, any possible you know, benefits, even if you think there are. I mean, I use this analogy that, you know, suppose that a school back in, you know, the bad old days of segregation at the K through 12 level said that, well, you know, we've looked at this and we've decided that we don't want to desegregate our high schools because it would have a bad effect on school spirit. And you know, you have a lot of kids that have been looking forward to going to a particular high school. Maybe their brothers and sisters went there, maybe their parents went there. You know, they're really pumped up about going to this high school. They've been looking forward to it all their lives, and now they're not going to be able to go there. Maybe they're even going to have to be transferred in the middle of the school year, you know, to go to a different high school. And that's just going to be a bad thing for school spirit. Okay, well, there's sort of two ways to address that kind of argument. You know, one is to bring in, you know, your expert witnesses and say that, well, no, actually, you know, school children this age are very malleable in their loyalties, and they will adopt, you know, equal loyalty and fervor for their new high school, and so actually the effect on school spirit is not going to be that great. But the other argument is to say, so what? Okay, maybe school spirit takes a hit, but it's worth it. It's worth it to get rid of racial discrimination. Racial discrimination is ugly. Jim Crow is ugly. It has huge costs, so that even if there is some tiny benefit to continuing segregation in terms of school spirit, it's just not worth it. Okay? And that's the kind of analysis that I think needs to be brought to racial and ethnic preferences in university admissions as well. Okay, so what are the possible benefits to racial and ethnic preferences in university admissions? Well, there are basically three that you can think of. The only one I think that anybody really believes, you know, deep down inside, is the remedial one. That America has a long, sad, tragic history of racial discrimination, particularly against African Americans, but also against other racial and ethnic groups. And we've got to do something to make up for that. You know, these people have been discriminated against, you know, for you know, hundreds of years, and so to help make matters right, we're going to have preferences, you know, in their favor. Okay. So that's the first argument. There are a couple of problems with that argument. The first one is that, legally, it's a non-starter. The Supreme Court's rejected that. And the Supreme, this is the argument of sort of generalized societal discrimination. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't justify racial preferences, using that kind of an argument. The Supreme Court was right to say so, too. After all, we're talking about, preferences now, not for slaves, not for former slaves, not for people who were even alive during the Jim Crow era. We're talking about, preferences for 18-year-old kids. That means, you do the math, kids who were born in, 1993. Now, does this mean that discrimination no longer exists in the United States, that the effects of discrimination are no longer with us, that some children cannot trace the fact that they are in poverty or that they have had this or that disadvantage to slavery or Jim Crow or something like that? No, I'm not arguing that. But I am arguing that it is, the Supreme Court was right to rule the way that it did, because, with every tick of the clock, these, effects become more and more, attenuated. They don't justify institutionalized racial discrimination in the other direction, and that it is poor policy to use race and ethnicity as a proxy for social disadvantage in this country. There are lots of people who are socially disadvantaged who happen to be white, or who happen to be Asian, who are being discriminated against by college admissions officers all the time. And conversely, there are lots of people who are African American or Latino who are not socially disadvantaged. And guess what? They get preferences by college admissions officers all the time. In fact, 86% of the African Americans who are given preferential treatment by selected colleges and universities come from upper class or middle class backgrounds. So this argument that we're doing this to help children who are socially disadvantaged because of the effects of slavery just doesn't work. So that's the first argument. Second argument is the prophylactic argument. This has nothing to do with birth control. It's the argument that left to their own devices, if we don't have preferential treatment in favor of some groups, they will be discriminated against. And so we have to do this in order to stop discrimination that would otherwise occur. Well, in some contexts, this might make sense. One case that went before the Supreme Court involved the Alabama State Troopers, who just were not going to hire African Americans. And the U.S. District Court judge who had the case finally gave them a quota that they had to meet. And he did this because he tried everything else and nothing else was working to stop the Alabama State Troopers from racial discrimination in hiring. Okay, fine. The Alabama State Troopers at that time probably were not going to stop discrimination without being given a quota. On the other hand, the suggestion that college admissions officers, the most politically correct people in the world, who have been cheerfully discriminating in favor of African Americans and Latinos for a long time now, the suggestion that they, left to their own devices, if they aren't discriminating in favor of African Americans and Latinos, are going suddenly to start discriminating against them is ludicrous. So the prophylactic argument is no good. So we're left with the diversity argument. The diversity argument is that, and this is the one that the Supreme Court bought in the University of Michigan cases, that because we want to have a robust exchange of ideas on campus, we need to have people from all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences and viewpoints, and one way to achieve that is by taking race and ethnicity into account of who gets admitted. Okay. The problem with that argument is that it uses stereotyping, right? I mean, you were saying that, oh, I can tell what this person's background and experiences and viewpoints are because he's black. Or because she's Latina. And we know that this guy has nothing to add to the diversity mix because he's white. This is stereotyping, right? I mean, if you want to achieve diversity of viewpoint and backgrounds and experiences, if you really think that that is going to improve, it's going to have educational benefits to the university's mission, fine, but don't use race and ethnicity as proxies for whether somebody is going to add diversity to the campus or not. It just doesn't make sense to do that. Again, I don't buy any of the arguments, therefore, as you can tell. I think that the diversity argument is weak. I think that the educational benefits are certainly overrated and exaggerated. We can't know whether a student is going to raise his or her hand in class and add some thought that nobody had thought of if we admit them. And there are better ways to achieve. If you want to teach people that not all black people think alike, which is the other argument that's made in favor of this. Well, you can assign the opinions of Justice Thurgood Marshall and the opinions of Justice Clarence Thomas, and students can learn that all black people don't think alike that way. You don't have to gamble that by using racial discrimination in admissions, some student might come and raise his hand and bring that point home. There are other, more direct, less discriminatory ways to achieve that end result. Okay. So anyway, I don't think very much of these purported benefits. But maybe I haven't persuaded you. Maybe you think that there is something to them, after all. But, as I said, you can't end your analysis there. You then have to say, okay, maybe there are some educational benefits. Maybe there are some nice things about having a classroom that looks like America or whatever. You then have to ask, is it worth the price of engaging in racial discrimination in order to achieve those benefits? What are some of these costs? Well, as I say, there are a lot of them, and I'm going to run through them fairly quickly. It's unfair to treat people differently because of skin color. To say that you would have gotten into this school had you been a different skin color, but you're not, and so therefore you don't get in. That is personally, unfair. It is divisive. You pick up the paper every day and you read about America. The census numbers are coming out. What a multiracial and multi-ethnic country this already was and is becoming more and more. And individual Americans are becoming more and more multiracial and multi-ethnic, like our president, for instance. Can we have a legal regime in a country like that sorts people according to what their skin color is and what country their ancestors came from, and treats some people better and other people worse, depending on which silly little box they check? Seems awfully divisive. Creates resentment. It sets a bad precedent. If you tell people that, well, you can engage in racial discrimination if you've got a good reason for it. Well, guess what? People always think they have a good reason for it. One of the things that my organization did when we filed an amicus brief in the University of Michigan cases was to look at the social science arguments that were made in Brown versus Board of Education. The people in favor of segregation had the chairman of the psychology department at Columbia University come and talk about how essential segregation was in order to have good education. You can always find social scientists who will say anything. And you certainly can find social scientists who will make arguments in favor of racial discrimination of this or that kind. So it's a very bad precedent if you start allowing racial discrimination whenever somebody can find a social scientist to say that there's some good that will come of it. You stigmatize the so-called beneficiaries of this. People are going to assume that if you're black and you got into Ohio State or the University of Michigan, that you don't have as good credentials as the white kids and Asian kids do. And as a general matter, that's true, but it may be completely false with respect to individuals. Well, you have racial preferences to thank for that stereotype. It fosters a victim mindset. It removes an incentive for academic excellence. It encourages separatism. It compromises the academic mission of the university if you're admitting people who aren't the best qualified. You create inevitable pressure to lower graduation and graduation standards and also grading standards. It fosters hypocrisy. It fosters a scofflaw attitude. One thing that's becoming increasingly clear is that by mismatching students and individuals, or excuse me, students and colleges, you end up actually hurting the people that supposedly you're helping. Rick Sander, who's a liberal law professor at UCLA, set out to prove that there were good effects from racial preferences in law school admissions and concluded that there are actually fewer African American lawyers now because of racial preferences. It sounds counterintuitive, but what he found was that because of racial preferences and this mismatch effect, students who are admitted to law schools, African American students who've been admitted to law schools over the year, have been less likely to graduate, more likely to flunk out or to become discouraged and drop out, and less likely to pass the bar exam because they have been in classes that have been taught at this level and they're at this academic level, and so they learn less. So this is another cost, the fact that you're actually hurting the people that you're supposedly helping. Papers over the real problems in society of why we have these disparities in test scores and in high school grades to start out with that seem to make this kind of preferential treatment necessary. You get involved in the ugly business of deciding which minorities you're going to favor and which ones you're going to disfavor. One thing that we found was that at the University of Michigan, Latinos were sometimes treated favorably, like African Americans were, but it depended on which flavor Latino you were. If you were Mexican American, then you were treated as if you were black and you got a preference. If you were any other kind of Latino, if you were from Central America or South America or the Caribbean, then you were treated as if you were white and you were discriminated against. Unless you were from Puerto Rico. If you were from Puerto Rico, then it depended on whether you were born on the mainland of the United States or in Puerto Rico itself. If you were born in Puerto Rico itself, then you were treated as if you were white. If you were born in the mainland USA, then you were treated as if you were black. This is the kind of ridiculous game you get into when you start playing favorites on the basis of what country people's ancestors came from or what their skin color is. And then, of course, there's the problem of what do you do about people from mixed families? Are we going to have a one-drop rule? Or are we going to be more nuanced than that? And how do you do that kind of nuanced weighing without something like the Nuremberg laws? Well, anyway, those are just some of the costs. And I think that if you fairly consider those costs, I think they're very hard to deny, and you weigh them against the benefits, which I think are very dubious, you've got to conclude that this is a bad thing and we should stop. Thank you.
I want to thank Mr. Clegg for addressing what is an important topic, and also, in many cases, a topic which not a lot of people are willing to talk about in law schools, in undergraduate admissions. It's a very controversial topic, and as he mentioned, it can be something that people have very strong opinions on. I also agree with him. I don't know if I'm going to change any minds here today, but I do want to at least provide some commentary on and thoughts on some of the benefits and costs that he identified, and also hopefully help you think about maybe some other benefits and costs that really didn't get mentioned down here. I think that to start off with, starting on the cost side, a lot of the costs, and the main one he mentioned is about unfairness, right? Well, in fact, a lot of the costs that we discussed are about, well, it's just not fair to have somebody preferred over somebody else. I think if you look at this from an individual perspective about, okay, does this person get in, does this person, whoever doesn't get in is going to feel like, well, the process was unfair. The question I think we're really getting at underneath this is, what are our educational systems, particularly what are our higher education systems for? Like, what do we want out of our universities? And if I can understand where Mr. Clegg is coming from, a lot of what he wants this to be is a meritocracy. The people who deserve to get in should get in. So let's talk about a little bit about what is a meritocracy? What is it that what merit are we looking for? And if I can listen to if I listen to the talk correctly, and of course he can correct me, a lot of what he wants us to be on is academic achievement. The people who are have the best SAT scores and the best GPAs, they should be admitted. The people that don't, ignoring all of the racial preferences. I think this ignores a little bit about how admissions actually works today. I don't think any university officer in the nation would tell you, yep, we just take their GPA, we take their SAT score, and we just, we line them up and we put them in there. I don't think even an entire, I don't think anybody would even say that is the ideal for what we could have in some post-racial society where all students of all races had exactly equal opportunity. Partly because we do prefer and we do give preference to all sorts of things, not just race, right? If you're going to start thinking about, well, what if we weigh one thing over another? We have to start thinking about, well, what about legacy admins? What about people that have had some sort of hardship in their life? What about people who are there on sports scholarships? And then also, what about the person that plays the oboe in the band, right? We want that person to be admitted because they add something to the life of the university that those that admissions officers think through and think are useful. So if we just said, all right, let's just take racial admissions out of this, we're still going to have some people favored over others for things that are not just GPA, SAT score, LSAT score. We're still going to favor some of those people, and we're still going to say, well, that's unfair too. So once we start talking about, well, fairness, we really have to start thinking about, is it really that we want universities that are complete meritocracies based on just numbers and scores, or do we want based on what we think is going to be useful for the university as a whole? Even if we could do this, right? Even if we said, you know what, we just want pure meritocracy, we just want a pure fairness, the people that have the best scores, the people that are most likely to do well in school, those are the people we should let in. That's still going to, you're still going to add a lot of subjectivity to that. Just, for example, we have to look at, to let people into Ohio State, do we have, we look at a vast, group of law students or potential law students from all across the nation, and we have to compare, well, this person has a 3.6 in computer science from, Miami University, well, this person has a 3.9 political science degree from Berkeley. Okay, well, which one of those people is more academically qualified? Which one of those people are we going to let in? Plus, anybody that's ever done any grading knows that unless you just have a Scantron sheet, there's going to be some inherited subjectivity in that. And in those areas of subjectivity, where people go to school, where people go to high school, where people, the social circumstances that people are raised in, you're going to get very different results. And we have, as when we're admitting people in schools, we have to think about, well, how much does race play a factor into that? Because we know, despite a lot of the gains that have been made by minorities in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we're not even 50 years away from the Civil Rights Act. Despite those gains, a lot of those differences end up being racially based. So, and even if finally we decided, hey, you know what? We actually managed to figure out some supercomputer system where everybody comes in equal, and we have a completely meritocracy-based system into which to let people into higher education or into law schools. What does that tell you? The question is, does that tell you who will succeed? The reason I ask this is we ask, well, we want a number of people in our large public institutions, our elite universities, our elite law schools. We want to have these people in there, but what does that, once we get them in there, what does that provide for us? And ultimately, what I would argue is that it's not just about getting in, it's also about what happens at the end of this. Because there, we have to sort of think about, all right, we've let a certain number of people into law school, and based on their LSAT scores, based on their GPAs, they have some certain academic profile. Does that tell us anything about what type of lawyers they're going to be? Does that tell us anything about, even if you have the best grades in your law school class, are you going to necessarily be the best lawyer? And the reason you want to ask this question is because universities, and I'm going to assert this, universities and law schools and elite educational institutions serve a function not just for the people that get in, not just for the people that are educated in them, but they serve a function in society. And that and the benefit, or the benefit to society, is that it produces for a small group of people, it produces for society, takes these group of people and they make them into the lawyers, into the leaders, into the workforce, into the society of tomorrow. And so when we're considering, we're considering costs and benefits, as Mr. Clegg spit out there. And he talked about, well, the diversity rationale in terms of, well, you get different perspectives. Even apart from that, is there a cost to us to saying our elite institutions are only open to a certain group of race, to only open to certain races? Is there a cost there? And I would argue that there is a cost. There's a societal benefit for you here at this law school. There's a societal benefit for people at elite institutions. There's a societal benefit for people to interact in a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. As Roger just pointed out, we do live in an increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial society. And having law schools that reflect that, having universities that reflect that, not just for, can you give me the Indian perspective on this case, but just in the sense that you interact with people on a daily basis in a post-racial society. That is a benefit not only to you, but it's a benefit to society as well. Because universities, at the end of the day, are one of the few institutions, if not the only institution, which takes people at a very formative time in their life, just after high school, taking them from the segregated, or at least increasingly economically segregated worlds in which they live in here in America, and actually throws them together in a way where they can all interact as equals. And that societal benefit, I feel, would be lost if we just decided, you know what, you're here on some pure meritocratic system in which we've, because of the way society exists, because of these, some of the things that he's rightly pointed out have been papered over. These differences, without necessarily addressing any of those, we're just going to say, well, we should just cut it off and call it a merit-based system, and yet somehow only get whites and very, very few blacks and a large number of Asian Americans. Something would be lost there. The chance for you, for students, for our society to interact in a way that not only is a benefit to you to interact with all of these people, but is a benefit to society to have you, the leaders of tomorrow, go out and interact in this increasingly multi-ethnic world. So, I'd love to hear, we wanted this to be a conversation,
okay.
So those are some thoughts I had, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these as well.
Well, thank you. And, I think that some of that I tried to anticipate. but let me just sort of clarify this. One thing you said was that there may be a lot of disadvantage out there that is not. We're not going to have the kind of diversity that we need to have in law schools because of the fact that there are a lot of disadvantaged people out there. The playing field is not even. But as I said, there are people of all races and ethnicities at both ends of the playing field, and if we want to give special consideration to people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, we don't have to use race and ethnicity as a proxy for disadvantage. We consider disadvantage directly. I also, I certainly am not saying that the only way that you can judge academic achievement is by how well people did on the SAT or what their grades were. And I'm happy for universities to consider anything that they consider to be relevant to a student's academic qualifications, but they should not have what amounts to a double standard and say that, well, we're only going to look at the SATs, but we're going to have a different cutoff point for blacks than we have for whites. If you think that the way to really tell if somebody is going to make a contribution is by looking at their essays or looking at their teacher recommendations or anything that you like, that's fine. But you should do that for everyone. Likewise, I don't even necessarily say that it has to be based strictly on academic qualifications. If universities want to have a good football team, and so they want to give preferences to the athletes, or they want to have a good band, so they want to give preferences to oboe players, or if they want to get more money from alumni, and so they want to give preferences to their alumni. I don't have any particular problem with that. I mean, I do actually. I don't really like alumni preferences for public universities, but putting that aside, you can do all of that, but I don't see how any of that is an excuse for racial discrimination. Racial discrimination is different. It is one thing to say to somebody, we're going to give you special treatment because we really need an oboe player. And then tell the other person, sorry, we know that you have slightly better SAT scores, but we really need an oboe player, and you play the tuba, and so we've already got a good tuba player. Well, that is a different conversation than saying that, we got too many Asians already. You're Asian. We really don't want any more Asians. It's not the mix that we want. That's different. Okay, it's different legally, it's different morally, it's different constitutionally, it's different historically. It's just different. Just two other things, because I think we probably want to get some questions and answers too. But the idea that we need to have more lawyers from all different walks of life and everything. Well, okay, that's fine. But as I said, the evidence is that you admit these kids and they don't become lawyers. Because they're mismatched. So if you're really serious about having more lawyers of a particular racial or ethnic background, I'm not sure if that's a good focus. But even if you are serious about that, I don't think that racial preferences are the way to accomplish it. And then finally, one thing is, I'm certainly not saying that our universities should be open only to certain racial and ethnic groups. I'm not saying that. I think that they should be open on a non-discriminatory basis to all racial and ethnic groups. That's what I'm all about. What I'm saying is that they should not engage, universities should not engage in this kind of discrimination. And the fact that it may result in some racial imbalances for some period of time, I don't find to be particularly problematic. I mean, for a long time, Jews were overrepresented at universities. I don't think that was a terrible thing. Asians are overrepresented particularly at a lot of universities on the West Coast. I don't think that that's a terrible thing. I don't think that universities should be trying to achieve a predetermined racial and ethnic mix. I think that, again, the cost of that outweigh any conceivable benefits. I really don't think much of the benefits. Do you want to?
Why don't we open up to questions
yeah.
and yeah.
And I'll leave it to you. Why don't you call on me? Because I don't know what.
Sure, I'll do that.
Do you want to sit? Yeah, well, we can both stand or.
All right, we've got a question right here.
Yeah, well, I have a question. Well, more of a not kind of statement. I think that I like your idea of Professor Clegg, was it?
Yeah. I'm not a professor.
Oh, Mr. Clegg, Esquire. I like your idea about not discriminating based on race. However, I think that it kind of neglects a certain historical fact. An analogy would be like if you're having a race run, and you start one person back 50 meters behind the other person in a 400-meter race, and then say, well, why didn't you finish at the same, look at this person got a better score, in this case, the time on the race or ACT score, whatever it is. I think you're neglecting to recognize certain facts about how things have developed historically and certain obstacles some people have had to overcome. Do you not agree with that?
I don't agree with that. That's, by the way, that's a great analogy. It was an analogy that Lyndon Johnson used in the 1960s in a famous speech that he gave, I think, at Howard University. But I don't think it washes, for a couple of reasons. Of course, one, as I said, I think this is the only argument that people, as I said, really believe, viscerally. I don't think that anybody really buys this diversity nonsense. I think that what people buy is the historical grievance argument. First problem with that is that legally it's a non-starter. The Supreme Court's rejected that. So, if the university announces that that its justification for its use of racial preferences is what you just said, their general counsel would have a coronary because the president would have announced something that's not going to fly in court. And I think rightly so, because, yeah, sure, I think, again, this is an argument that the playing field is not level. Not every child in the United States has the same opportunities to, have the educational, the education that prepares them to take the SAT and go to, and do well on it and, go to a top school. But those kids come in all colors. And, conversely, there are kids who have very privileged backgrounds who come in all colors too. President Obama said that he didn't think that his daughters should get special treatment when they apply to college on the basis of skin color. And the overwhelming majority of African Americans who get preferential treatment and get into Ivy League schools come from middle class and upper class backgrounds. So they aren't, the kids who are getting the preferences are not, the ones that have been hobbled, in the way that you described. So, conservatives and liberals and all kinds of people can have differences of opinion on how, whether, universities should consider social disadvantage in deciding who gets admitted or not. And there are decent arguments on both sides, but I really don't think that there is a decent argument that we should be using skin color as a proxy for social disadvantage. If we want to give preferences for social disadvantage, give preferences for social disadvantage. But, look at the individual. There are more poor white people in the United States than there are poor black people. Not as a percentage matter, but, in absolute terms, because there's lots more white people. So if what we're trying to do is to help poor people, why should we assume that there aren't any white poor people?
Well, but they're not poor from the history of,
Well, what difference does that make? You got 4 kids in front of you, all right? And one of them's poor because, he has an expert witness who can prove that his poverty can be traced to slavery. Yeah, and that these other bad lifestyle decisions that maybe other descendants of slaves made were not made by his parents and grandparents. It was all because of slavery and Jim Crow. All right, so that's their first kid. The second kid is poor because his parents just got here from Guatemala. All right. The next kid is poor because his parents just got here from the Philippines. And then this kid is poor. He's a white kid, and he's poor because he's from Appalachia. And you have a government program that's that will help people who come from impoverished backgrounds. It's some kind of remedial education program to get them. It's a boot camp to get them ready to take the SAT. Why should you say, you three here, you're poor for the wrong reason. I'm not going to help you. Now you have a reason that really appeals to me. And because you're the right color and because you can trace your disadvantage to something that I find appealing, I'm going to make this program available to you. But not to say it doesn't make any sense.
No questions. There's a lot of them. Yes, Craig.
Actually, I pretty much agree with everything you've said so far, except for the part where you said where it doesn't matter how it came about being poor. I mean, because I think there's just this inherent sense and feeling that we get when you say, hey, that person walked into a wall, so he got, a bruise on his face because he walked into a wall, versus someone went and punched that guy in the face, so you got a bruise that way. I mean, you feel
You're
like
talking about the children, though, and I understand. I agree with that. And but we're talking about the kids here, okay? The kid did not walk into a wall, okay? The white kid is poor not because he made the voluntary decision to be born in Appalachia, because he made the voluntary decision to have a single teenage alcoholic mother or whatever. He's poor for reasons beyond his control. And I agree. I mean, I'm a conservative, and I think people should be held accountable. And I'm not wild about. I think people should bear the consequences of their decisions. But that's not my hypothetical.
Questions? Yes.
I'm confused how you go from this data to imposing all of those statements onto the college admissions office. That because there's an overrepresentation of lower test scores among minorities who get in, that all they're doing is looking at they're black so they get in. That's it. That they ignore diversity statements, they ignore adversity that they've overcome. This is an admissions officer. He's telling you what they consider, and you're imposing your assumptions on him.
Well, this is just evidence, okay? And it is possible. It is possible that the statistical data that we have here that shows that the odds ratios favoring African Americans are 10 to 1 or 8 to 1. That really the reason for that is it's not because of race. It's because African Americans just write really, really good essays. And that Asian kids and white kids, they just don't have what it takes when it comes to essay writing. Or teacher recommendations. Black kids, Latino kids, they get good teacher recommendations. White kids and Asians, not so much. It's possible, but I don't think so. Now, to some extent it may be that, if you're looking at disadvantage, social disadvantage, and if a disproportionate number of, applicants who happen to be black are, socially disadvantaged, that may explain some of this. But I don't think it's going to explain all of it. And, if Ohio State and Miami want to come back and say, well, look, we can prove that the reason for these numbers is because of disadvantage and not because of race, fine. But, they say on their websites that they consider race and ethnicity. So, they're admitting to doing some degree of racial and ethnic discrimination in admissions. And I doubt that, it's going to be explicable, for non-racial reasons.
Questions? Yes, in the back.
My question, kind of relates to that. It's more about socioeconomic status, though. I know that Miami specifically has a program that lets in students under like 30,000, I believe, to the university and gives them scholarships. How do you see that as relating to your data? Because wouldn't you think that socioeconomic status would relate to race, and that would lead to these higher numbers?
Well, it depends on who's applying. That assumes, first of all, I don't know what percentage of the total enrollment, is chosen, as part of this, under 30,000 program. And I don't know, what the racial, makeup, is of people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. As I said, it's possible that there will be racial disparities there. That more that the African Americans who apply are more likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds than whites. But I wouldn't automatically assume that. And because like I say, there's plenty of poor whites, including right here in Ohio. And a lot of the preferences seem to be going to out-of-state minorities, who may or may not, be poor. But no, it's certainly possible that some of the preference may be being given because of socioeconomic status. And all I can say is that, the figures that I quoted before, about 86% of African Americans who get into selective colleges and universities being from upper class or middle class backgrounds, that's actually from a very liberal study. In this book called The Shape of the River, published about a decade ago, it was a defense of racial and ethnic preferences. And they conceded that most of the preferences were not going to disadvantaged African Americans, but to middle class or upper class African Americans.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify something you said earlier. I guess, were you saying that you think students who are applying to college now who are of a certain ethnic group don't face the same sort of institutionalized disadvantages that their parents might have faced? Like you were saying that we've moved so far beyond the civil rights era that it just isn't an issue anymore?
I wouldn't say that. It's certainly less of an issue. I think that, on the one hand, certainly, racial discrimination still exists. Racial discrimination will always exist. There will always be racists out there of all colors. So, no, I'm certainly not saying that racism no longer exists. I'm not saying that the effects of racism are not still with us. But what I am saying is that, the kind of, institutionalized discrimination that existed in, the 1950s and 1960s does not exist now. We've made enormous progress. It is now, illegal to engage in discrimination in just about any kind of public transaction, voting, education, employment, public accommodations, lending, housing, you name it. So to use the fact that, to use slavery and Jim Crow as a justification for institutionalized discrimination, in the other direction, for kids who were born in 1993 is unpersuasive. And again, if you, I'm sure it's true that a disproportionate number of African American, a lot of African American kids will be able to trace their poverty, their disadvantage, to Jim Crow and slavery. I think that can be done. Now, there are other factors too, like the fact that 7 out of 10 African Americans now are born out of wedlock, which I actually think is a bigger problem than racism. But it's certainly true that racism still exists and that the effects of racism, still exist. And that disadvantaged kids can, trace, to some extent, their disadvantage to that. But why are we using, as I said before, why are we using race as a proxy for disadvantage? There are lots of black kids who are not disadvantaged and a lot of white kids who are disadvantaged. So if what we're concerned about is helping kids who are disadvantaged through no fault of their own, why does it matter whether they can trace that disadvantage to racism as opposed to, the fact that their parents are recent immigrants, or the fact that they're from Appalachia, or something else?
Questions? Yes.
This is more for Professor Batra. What would you see?
He's hogging the conversation.
What would you see as the cost of removing race from the application process for universities and institutions of higher education altogether? Whether removing boxes where you try and label yourself a race, or putting restrictions on personal statements or essays that you have to answer. What would you see as the cost of taking measures such as that?
Sure. I mean, we don't have to just, we don't have to guess about what the cost would be. I mean, we saw this happen in California. Prop 209 was passed. They removed all race, all racial, they took the box away, right? And so a couple statistics for you. In 1995, at UC Berkeley, the percentage of African Americans was something like 6.5%. It's now less than half of that in 2005. UCLA 7.3%, now something like 2.7%. So you will see a vast drop in particularly African American enrollment. You'll see a increase absolutely in Asian American enrollment, which is great for my kids, but probably bad for society as a whole, right?
You're sure about it?
I mean, there's the cost, right? So, I mean, you'll definitely see a drop. You'll see less diverse universities as a whole. And as I tried to, allude to before, I mean, a less diverse educational system is a cost on society, and which was, sort of the main thrust. That is the cost that we're going to face.
I will say that some of those students, the overall numbers for African Americans and Latinos actually did not change. It was more reshuffling. It's not like, well, if you don't get into University of California, Berkeley, you have no choice but to go out and hold up liquor stores or something like that. There are other universities in California, and in fact, you saw schools like UC Riverside and so forth go up. And this is just, people think that the UC system, and people who aren't from California think that it's the whole thing. Well, the UC system is actually the top part of the University of California public university program. And even within that, the rates did not change very much. And it's not even counting, the Cal State program and then the community college program.
Just to touch on a point
Sure.
there. Actually, that sort of argument, I think, cuts both ways about, well, if it's not, it's Harvard or, on the streets, right?
Yeah,
I think that cuts both ways in terms of, if we're excluding, even if we take, the framing, if we exclude a particular Asian American or a particular white person from a particular college, it's not like they will have no chance to go anywhere else either.
All right, we've got time for probably one more question. Craig? All right, go ahead.
Is there an argument to be made that affirmative action had its time and place? Like, would you agree to that? That in circa 1965, there was a time and place for it, and now it's run its course, or is it just it never once had time and place?
Personally, I think it was a mistake from the beginning. But as I said, I mean, as sort of a broad institutional matter. I can conceive of some specific instances, like the example I gave with the Alabama State Troopers, where if you had a particularly intransigent institution that was just refusing to treat people non-discriminatorily, that this might have been the only thing that you could do. But I think on balance, I think it was a bad idea from the beginning. But you don't have to agree with me on that. I mean, that's an academic issue. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but the question now is, where do we go from here? And as long as we can all agree that it's a bad idea from now going on, that's fine.
All right, with that, please join me in a round of applause for